Yeah? You want to take it off?
The outside. Come on.
I'm a mom of a young child, and so I try every day and in everything that I do to keep him healthy and safe and thriving. And in our lives and in the decisions that we make for our family, we limit exposure to chemicals as much as we possibly can. But there's always that fear when you go out into a public space or to a school or a playground that we don't know what's being used in those spaces or how or when, and we don't have any control over that. And of all the things that we are worried about day to day, I don't want to add my playground to that list. And I appreciate that in my community we're working towards eliminating them in public places, but it's always a concern when you go to a place that you don't know, or you go and your child is rolling on the grass and you're not sure what that grass has been treated with or when. Those are real fears because the science is clear. We know the impact of pesticides and herbicides on brain development in children. It's not debated anymore. The last piece that we need is the political will to change our habits, to change the power of chemical companies who have taken over how we think of environment and wellness and turned us into guinea pigs for profit. And I don't find that acceptable. I find that we have a lot of courageous people doing powerful work to raise awareness about the impact, from epidemiologists down to citizen scientists and moms who have seen negative impacts in communities that are hard hit by chemicals, and we are obliged to act. I support Beyond Toxics, and they're a really exciting non-toxic Oregon project hoping to move cities and municipalities away from heavy pesticide use in public spaces. I think that that's a step that Oregon can take leadership on. I am grateful to the city of Eugene for putting a moratorium on the use of glyphosate in our public parks, because that's one thing off our list. That's one chemical that we can say we don't use. So I hope that in every little way that of all of us standing up and talking about what we care about, we'll find that political will together to change how we think about our environment and our spaces and how we want to think about our health and our children's health.